The hubris of BBC executives is an amazing thing to witness. The chief executive of news, having resigned in disgrace, still maintains the fiction that the BBC is not institutionally biased. Well, join me as we go on a deep dive into showing just how biased the BBC truly is, and we'll reveal also which BBC public figures have formerly been Maoists and Trotskyists. Hello, I'm Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. The BBC is in crisis, and its supporters are circling the wagons around it, claiming that there is a right-wing conspiracy to undermine Auntie. Well, the truth is, there isn't any conspiracy. The BBC is deeply biased. The 2021 Sirota Review found that there was a culture of defensiveness around the BBC whenever it is attacked and accused of making mistakes. Well, I would say that the last few days' reaction has shown that that culture of defensiveness is as strong as ever. The fact that the two people who resigned from the BBC, its Director General, Tim Davies, and its news CEO, Deborah Turnus, the fact that they still maintain this idea that there is no institutional bias at the BBC perfectly illustrates the level of delusion that exists within that institution. BBC staff are often blinded by their inability to see their own biases, and they wrongly believe that their elite beliefs is the only acceptable viewpoint. So how can they be biased? There cannot be any other legitimate viewpoint. It's also true that a disproportionately high number of BBC employees are middle class, are young, are ethnic minorities, or come from the LGBT community in far higher levels than you'll find elsewhere. And so, of course, they will have a groupthink that is radically different to that of the rest of the population. Now, the BBC is not unique in this way at all. With the exception of GB News and Talk TV, you will find exactly the same type of people employed at Sky News, at Channel 4, at ITV and ITN, even increasingly as well. And it's the same in America. ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, aside from Fox, you get the same thing. But impartiality matters at the BBC and for the BBC much more than for any other organization. Because if you think that Sky News is biased, you can just simply stop being a consumer of Sky News and not watch it. But the British public own the BBC. We are the paymasters. Well, those of us who pay the license fee. The BBC, therefore, has a duty in law to respect all sides, to be impartial and not show favour to one side or another. And it should also be said that many people on the left and the right criticise the BBC for being biased. And that's often a defence you'll hear from BBC advocates. They will say, oh, well, we get just as many letters from the left, from the Corbynistas, as we do from the right, from the Nigel Faragists claiming bias. Therefore, we must be doing something right. That's very different. They will attack Corbyn and Farage in equal measure, you'll find quite often. What we're talking about is something different. It's not the traditional right-left politics. It's this elite metropolitan liberal bias, this progressive attitude when it comes to things like race, when it comes to things like immigration, to gender, sexual orientation. It's that view which permeates beyond the traditional right-left imbalance. So don't buy into anyone who says, well, the far left think that there's bias just as the right wing do. That's not true at all. In fact, the evidence is quite clear on this front. The remarkable thing is that the BBC in the past has repeatedly admitted it does have a liberal metropolitan elite bias. So why today they're claiming otherwise, I don't know. If you look here, for example, back in 2007, an internal report attacked the BBC's liberal consensus. In 2010, Mark Thompson, the former Director General of the BBC, gave an interview in which he said the BBC was guilty of massive bias to the left. He said that that was improving, that it was now more like the New Statesman, which again is a left-wing magazine. And in 2013, you had the former news director, Helen Bowden, who said that the BBC had deep liberal bias in its coverage of immigration. So it's been well established. The BBC itself, its most important figures, have acknowledged this. Internal reviews have acknowledged this bias. So why on earth are we hearing from today's BBC figures that there is no such thing as bias? But let's even look at some well-known figures. Look at Peter Sissons, for example. Now, Peter Sissons, well-respected newsreader, and when he left office, he admitted the degree to which the BBC was biased. In his autobiography, he argued that the BBC had a left-wing mindset in its very DNA. He said that BBC News has a bias towards New Labour, the United Nations, the European Union, environmental groups, Islam, ethnic minorities, and women. I have no doubt that the majority of BBC staff vote for political parties of the left. It should also be noted the BBC is, or at least was until recently, the biggest single consumer of The Guardian. And The Guardian is actually the most read newspaper at the BBC as well. Let's turn to John Humphreys, well-respected news anchor and interviewer on the Today programme on Radio 4. And he also took a swipe at the metropolitan liberal bias, an institutional liberal bias, as he says here. And then let's look at the other side. You know, people like Andrew Neil have also said this as well. But Peter Sissons, John Humphreys, and Andrew Neil are very much in the minority. They were two or three of the very few centre-right broadcasters at the BBC, completely outnumbered by people on the left. People like Andrew Marr. Now, Andrew Marr was formerly a Maoist and a member of the Socialist Campaign for a Labour Victory, a left-wing pressure group. His interest in Mao Zedong began at an early age, and he would give people copies of Mao's Little Red Book. He was even known as Red Andy at university. He now claims to be a social democrat, and even he actually has come out and criticised what's happened to the BBC in terms of the rise of woke. He says that a publicly funded urban organisation with an abnormally large proportion of younger people, of people in ethnic minorities, and almost certainly of gay people, compared with the population at large, creates an innate liberal bias inside the BBC. Someone who's not so aware of bias at the BBC is Paul Mason. Now, Paul Mason was the culture and digital editor and also the economics editor of BBC Newsnight. Now, it's hard to find somebody who's more left-wing than Paul Mason. He's a former member, as you can see here, of the Workers' Power Group. Now, the Workers' Power Group is an openly Trotskyist organization, a revolutionary Trotskyist organization. Then we have Lewis Goodall, who was also a news editor or politics editor at Newsnight, and he was a Labour activist before he joined the BBC. And indeed, if you'll look and see, he's married to a woman who is the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change's senior climate and energy policy advisor. There you have his former colleague at BBC Newsnight, who is now his colleague at the Newsagent podcast, Emily Maitness. She was formally reprimanded by the BBC for her attack on Dominic Cummings and her clear bias as well. So it's quite obvious that the BBC's bias is deeply entrenched. It's entrenched on an institutional level. It's entrenched on an individual level, with a far greater proportion of people at the BBC perpetuating ideas of an elite class. But there are other ways in which bias can be presented. So, for example, it can be reflected in the way in which guests are invited onto programs. So quite often, for example, if you'll watch a political panel program such as BBC Newsnight, you will see somebody from the Labour Party, perhaps also someone from the Lib Democrats, and then as the third and sole right-wing person, you'll have a wet Tory, someone like Ed Vaizey or Damien Green. And they all share those same metropolitan, liberal, cultural and social views, and also similar views on immigration. Now, the BBC still is excellent at political interviews. I mean, Andrew Neil was the master of that and treated everybody right and left fairly. I would say there are many others who still do an excellent job like that. Nick Robinson, I would say personally, quite clearly his bias, but when he does hard-hitting interviews, he will give both right and left an equally hot examination. But whilst it strives for impartiality, you know, it's very clear if you watch the rest of or listen to the rest of the Today program or things like Woman's Hour, the bias is clear in the most obvious ways. And so to pretend that there is no bias at the BBC is to deny reality. As I said, you have the Sirota review in 2021, which showed quite clearly that the BBC had a culture of defensiveness about its mistakes. And the difference here, of course, is that whilst the BBC is not the only institution to have succumbed to the long march through the institutions, it's affected all of our institutions, at the BBC it has been noticeable for far longer. You can trace this back to the 1960s. And as I say, more than any other institution, its future rests upon its accuracy and its trustworthiness. And that's why the BBC is in crisis. So what is the current crisis really about? Well, of course, it's about this dossier that was leaked, conducted by Michael Prescott. And the findings of this are quite damning. But the findings, again, have been completely spun by BBC supporters and activists on the left. If you were to listen to people like Esther Ranson or Emily Maitlis, you would think this entire episode is just about the fact that a documentary about Donald Trump edited a single clip to show Trump in a poor light, and that was the only problem. Far from it. Don't believe any of that. The dossier was far more revealing than that. The dossier revealed, for example, that the rest of the documentary had on it many more commentators and pundits and talking heads who were anti-Trump than were pro-Trump. So there was a clear bias in the whole documentary. Now, I've not heard that being said by anybody in the media, yet it's clearly there in the report. Also said that in the election campaign for Donald Trump, Kamala Harris got a much better airing than Donald Trump did on the BBC. Also, it said that with Israel-Hamas coverage, places like BBC Arabic had platformed extreme anti-Semites. One chap over 100 times was on BBC Arabic, despite having said the most outrageously appalling things about the Jews. And in fact, BBC Arabic would always post on its channel articles from BBC News that dealt with Israeli attacks, but would never actually print anything or publish anything dealing with Hamas. Also with transgender coverage, Prescott points out how people felt that there was a culture of silence around gender-critical issues. You had an LGBT desk which was tasked with dealing with these sorts of issues, and they essentially had an agenda. They saw themselves more as activists than as journalists. They would blacklist gender-critical organizations like the LGBT Alliance and other organizations like that, and often journalists who wanted to expose some of the dangers, for example, of puberty blockers and so forth, were pressured not to produce those. And in fact, in some cases, as you have here with this article here, a BBC editor claims she was forced out of the BBC because of her gender-critical views. And it's a very long read, but it's worth showing how resistant the LGBT desk was to anybody who had even the most minor pushback against the propaganda that was being pushed out by them. Another aspect is history. So BBC, of course, has been pushing woke history in its documentaries, and a group of leading historians in the country from History Reclaimed, which includes such well-known figures as Lord Roberts, Andrew Roberts, who's been on this channel, Neil Ferguson, Nigel Biggar, also been on this channel, and many others, told the BBC that they are producing documentaries with characters presenting them who are not experts in this field and who clearly have an agenda. And we just have had now, recently, the BBC's documentary series on Empire with David Olusoga. Now, how many people know that David Olusoga only has a BA in history? I mean, the way he's celebrated by the BBC, you would think he's got a PhD in the subject. He's just got a BA, was a researcher with the BBC, and because of his, his identity, was promoted into the role he is currently. And he pushes a very strong anti-colonialist, anti-British feel throughout all of his productions. And it goes far further than that. In fact, if you look at History Reclaimed, did an analysis of several BBC documentaries and programs, The Misadventures of Ramesh Raghunathan, Samuel Jackson's Enslaved, the one on the Benin Bronzes. They looked at the Bengal famine as well, and they found universally that there was an anti-British agenda, blaming Churchill for the Bengal famine despite all the evidence points to the contrary, failing to mention the role of Africans in the slave trade, pointing out all the negatives of the British Empire, none of the positives. So there again, we see almost every aspect of BBC's output is in one way or another influenced and negatively affected by this overarching bias. The BBC has also, of course, been accused of overplaying racism. Prescott in his report says that the BBC would all too often claim that there was racism where there was none, ill-researched material. For example, it highlights a report claiming that people living in areas with a high proportion of ethnic minorities paid more for car insurance, and they blame that on racism. Well, there was no evidence of that whatsoever. And of course, it's the same across all the other areas. Here we have another review showing that 75% of slots on comedy panel shows are taken up by anti-Brexit, left-leaning comedians. There's a surprise for you. The panelists on Have I Got News for You, Mock the Week as it was, and all these other shows clearly have had for many years a great left-wing bias. Civitas, the think tank, did a report showing, for example, during the whole Brexit era, of 4,000 guests talking on Radio 4's Today programme over a decade from 2005 to 2015, only 3% were Brexiteers. Imagine that. Out of 4,000 guests, only 3%, 132, were actually Brexiteers. That should come as a surprise to nobody. The clear takeaway, of course, I mean, this is not to attack all BBC output, it should be said. I still think there are many documentaries the BBC does which are excellent. If they're not dealing with political or contentious history, they do excellently well. I just saw an excellent 3-part series on the history of Vienna by Simon Sebag Montefiore. Brilliant to watch all of that. I still think their investigative journalism programs are excellent when they're not being manipulated, but they do good things there. I think their political debates and so forth also can be very good as well. But, unfortunately, there's far too much else that's wrong with the BBC for it to really continue along the ways that it is. Increasingly, I find myself watching BBC 4, which is the archive channel, and there at least I can watch programs, as I'm sure you can also, free from political agendas and free from manipulation. I'm now watching Call My Bluff and Face the Music. We must remember the mission of the BBC under the Royal Charter, as it says here, is to act in the public interest, serving all audiences through the provision of impartial, high-quality and distinctive output and services which inform, educate and entertain. Those are the Lord Reith principles, the founder of the BBC, to inform, educate and entertain. I would posit it hasn't done much of that for the past 20 years, especially the last 10 years. Now, do I have faith in the BBC board to try to deal with all of this, to appoint the best people tasked with the job of cleaning up all of this bias, the new Director General, the new Chief Executive of News? Given that they don't acknowledge that the BBC is institutionally biased, doesn't leave one with much hope. The chairman of the BBC is a man called Samir Shah. Now, Samir Shah was for 10 years also chairman of the Runnymede Trust. Now, the Runnymede Trust is a terrible woke organisation. It was the Runnymede Trust that popularised the term Islamophobia in the UK. We have them to thank for Islamophobia as a term in the UK. And it was set up specifically to tackle structural racism, which of course we found out from Lord Sewell's report on racial disparities. The structural racism is not a major cause of issues relating to ethnic disparities in the country. Samir Shah is also chairman of the Museum of the Home. Now, the Museum of the Home, a once great institution that's become terribly woke, used to be the Jeffrey Museum, named after a great philanthropist called Jeffrey, and in the whole BLM insanity, they chose to change the name of this wonderful building, which was a gift of this great 18th century philanthropist. Then we have the deputy chairman of the BBC board, and this is Sir Damon Buffini. He's also a governor of the Wellcome Trust. Now, the Wellcome Trust has gone terribly woke in recent years. It closed down its wonderful The Medicine Man exhibition, which was a collection of 17th and 16th and 18th century bodies and wooden and wax and ivory skeletons and pieces of anatomy, because it deemed it to be racist, sexist, and ableist. He's also chairman of the National Theatre, which of course we know is also an excruciatingly woke organisation. So with the notable exception of someone like Sir Robbie Gibbs, who was Theresa May's number 10 spin doctor, the rest of the BBC board also seems to be inculcated with the same sort of ideological bias or institutional bias and imbalance. For example, the other members is Caroline Thompson, and she's the wife of the staunch Blairite and arch-Remainer Lord Liddell, against whom I debated during the whole Brexit campaign many years ago now. So the BBC is in crisis. It's an existential crisis, potentially. Is the BBC board up to the task of selecting the sort of Director General and Chief Executive of News that it so desperately needs? Well, their resumes certainly don't fill one with much confidence. Thank you very much.